Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. So this video has been very long in the making. This is my Regency stays video. So I started this project literally 6 months ago. It was the second project I ever started, so I learned a lot through this process. Pretty much had no idea what I was doing at the beginning. The only thing I had made was my 18th century dress, which is very shady sewing. Before I get into talking about like what I did and used and everything, I want to talk a little bit about what people wore as undergarments in the Regency era. So the stays in this time were very soft. There was cording instead of boning, and they were usually made of just cotton. And since the waistlines were so high, they didn't have to really shape the torso. They just had to kind of lift the boobs like a push-up bra, but just really old and made out of linen. So I guess that's that out of the way. I want to make this quick because this video is going to be very long already, but for the inspiration for this project, I used a mix of modern just YouTubers and some pictures from museums and things like that. This is not a historically accurate recreation. It's just sort of like an inspired by history thing. So I will definitely put the pictures that I based this process on, especially the cording pattern, somewhere up on the screen. I only used a few references. For the pattern, I got it off of a website, so I'm going to try to find it and put it down below, but I'm not going to include the pattern in this video just because honestly I don't think it's very good and I didn't make it myself. So I think that's pretty much it. So I will let you get into watching this 6-month process of me making these basically on a very old push-up bra. So the first thing I did was figure out my pattern from the website I used and then pin it to the fabric and cut everything out. And obviously the next step was to sew all the pieces together where they needed to be sewn, which was the side back seams, the side seams, and there is a middle front seam in this particular pattern. I did these seams with a full back stitch, and it was my first time doing a full back stitch, so honestly it wasn't that great. But I learned a lot from this, so that's all that matters. I obviously repeated this process with my other fabrics because this is a 3-layer pair of stays. So I used a white interfacing and a sort of off-white muslin, and I kind of just used those as one cohesive fabric. And I wasn't too careful with my seam allowance. I just marked out my actual seam lines. After I had both layers, I guess, sewn together, I figured out how I was going to add a busk pocket in, because this will have an inserted busk at the end. I made this able to fit about 5 popsicle sticks taped together. Very makeshift, but it works. After that, it was time to figure out where my gussets were going to go. So to do this, I marked them out with one line down the center and then a line 1/4 of an inch away from the middle line. And then I had to backstitch around this before I cut the actual gusset just to make sure everything stayed secure. Thankfully, I was getting a little bit better at backstitching and my stitches were getting a little bit more even by this point, so I feel like they held up fairly well for a beginner. After I had finished with that, it was time to actually cut the places for the gussets to be inserted, and at this point I had already spent quite a bit of time on this project, or so I thought back then, so cutting into it was kind of scary, but I mean, what else was I going to do? It needed to be done. So I just kind of went cold turkey and tried to insert the gusset, but I found that I really needed to iron down the seam allowance, and although this was already a difficult process, especially for somebody who hadn't sewn very much at this point, it made my life a heck of a lot easier. And then I tried overcasting the seam allowance at first, but this was because I didn't know what felling was yet, so I watched a video on felling and that worked out much better. And this is basically 2 layers at this point, so I had to do both the flower insert gussets into the muslin material and the muslin insert gussets into the flower material. This makes it reversible, so I had to repeat this process 8 times, which was a lot. For the muslin insert gussets, I used the interfacing too so that all of the fabric would look the same and that you wouldn't see the flower pattern through the muslin. So before sewing these in, I basted the white interfacing and the muslin together, and then I drew out my seam lines of the gusset onto them so that I would know exactly where to sew. After they were put in, I took out the basting stitches, which I found to be actually a quite satisfying process. This is my first time ever basting anything, so um, and after I did that, I fell down these seams again, and this is kind of a more in-depth look at how I did it, just cutting down the 2 layers, or the layer, yeah, I guess 2 layers underneath, and then folding the top layer around it, and whip stitching or felling it to the lining. Then, because my center seam wasn't very strong, I decided to add some embroidery to help hold it together better, and I'm actually really glad I did this, even though it took longer, even longer than this was already going, because it just gave it a really nice look, and I feel like it added some extra design and just personality that it wouldn't have had if I would have decided not to do this. And to do this, I literally just drew it out with an erasable pen, and and then went over it with the colors of thread that I wanted. And I obviously had to repeat this on both the flower layer and the muslin layer. And I did slightly different colors just to change it up on both sides. Next, it was time to fully insert the busk pocket. So I actually had a sewing machine by this point, and I decided it would be a lot quicker and easier to start using that. So I lined everything up as best I could and then sewed the edges of the busk pocket in. This took like probably 5 attempts to get right. It honestly ended up being crooked, and I just had to put a lot of time and effort into pinning it into place. In retrospect, as a more experienced seamstress now, I would have basted it. After that, before I fully sewed everything together, I decided I needed to fell all of the inside seams down. First, because I felt they needed extra strength, and also I didn't want them to fray inside since this type of garment takes a lot of strain just being worn. When I was done with that, I lined everything up to sew it into place, and I made sure to make sure the gussets were aligned as well as I could, and then it was time to baste everything together and then decide how I was going to do my cording. So I sewed channels that were about 1/8 of an inch thick to do the cording, but in retrospect I would have made them just a tad bigger than an eighth of an inch because it was super hard to get the yarn through these channels, and it took just a lot of time and effort, and my hands hurt so bad for like a month doing this. Before I actually sewed the cording channels, I thought it would be best if I sewed along the very bottom because I was sure that that seam I wasn't going to need to change it, and I just felt it would hold everything in place better than if I would have just left everything kind of loosely basted as it was. So this was one of my first few cording channels, and I just absolutely loved the way it looked. I was so happy that it was working out, and so happy that I was actually able to do this for the first time, anything like this for the first time. And as you can see, there's some wrinkling. If I were to do this over again with more experience, I would have cut everything on the bias, but I didn't really understand grain line at this point, so I mean, it's not that wrinkled and it works just fine, so I'm very happy with it. After having the bottom cording and the middle cording done, I wanted to try it on to make sure it was going to hold up well, because honestly, yarn doesn't seem like the most sturdy material, and couldn't really wrap my brain around how this was going to actually give me any support. But after trying it on, I realized that it actually does give a lot of support. Now this is a good time to talk about that I definitely overestimated the size I would need the gussets. So you can see kind of here when I was showing it that they're kind of gaping open a little bit when they should be more flat and help push up the bust instead of sort of cupping it like a modern bras do today. It worked out fine though. I just added a drawstring at the very end, as you'll see, and I feel like it works out good. Now, in addition to the front cording, I also decided to add cording around the side seams and the side back seams because I felt that they needed a little bit more strength and also that it would help keep the seams aligned and secure when I was wearing it. And remember, this is double-sided, so a row of cording goes between the interfacing and the flowered material as well as the interfacing and the muslin material, so each cording channel has to have two pieces of yarn stuffed through it, basically, if that makes any sense. Now the hardest, I would say, cording channels to do were probably the ones around the gusset, just because it was a really weird angle to get around the gussets properly. I don't know, it was just really hard, and it was a mess. The good thing is I think it looks really pretty when it's finished, and it also gives a lot of support and really helps to give the right shape for this era. Lastly, I did the cording channels around the side back seam. These were pretty much as hard as the gussets. And quickly, a tip I wanted to show is I found it really helpful when the cording channels were tight to stuff a big plastic embroidery needle through before I went and pulled the yarn through with a thinner metal embroidery needle. I just thought that the initial part where you pull the yarn through went a lot easier, and therefore it made it a lot easier to get it fully through the cording channel, and I didn't have to fight with it as much. That being said, my fingers were still really sore, and I totally understand why it was common for men to make stays in corsets throughout history, because it does take a lot of hand strength, like a surprising amount of hand strength, to actually get everything corded and get the boning into place. So this is what they looked like when they were all corded, but not fully finished, I guess. Yeah, this is just me being extremely happy that I got this all done because this took forever and was really hard. Um, Kind of a funny story about this is between each time that I did like a few rows of cording, I would show my mom this, and she literally didn't understand. I mean, I was really happy, but she didn't get it. She was like, "Why are you showing me this? Because it still looks like a rag with yarn hanging off of it." And I mean, I get it, but I was really happy about this because obviously this is the first time I've ever done this. Okay, so I'm just trying on the, like, how it is right now with a t-shirt under, and I've pinned one strap where it's gonna be over in the back more like a racer back, like a sports bra. It's just like moved over a little bit because I left an inch on either side for like fraying and seam allowances and adjustments, so I'm pinning the back one all the way over, so I'm using all of that space, and I'm pinning this one, so I'm taking off a ½ inch from each side, This one I pinned where I took a 1/2 inch from each side on the front and back strap, and I don't like this one. I feel like it's gonna fall off all the time, and I think this one's gonna do so much better. I'm gonna try the dress on too to see if it'll match, because I like that would suck if it showed through after I did all this work, but this is the one I'm thinking, and I'll try to show what I mean by that when I take it off. Okay, I couldn't get the dress closed because I keep stabbing myself, but I think it'll work. As you can see, the strap isn't showing from the side of the dress, and it's not even closed all the way and tightened, so I think it'll actually work. Yeah, anyway, I'm very nervous to cut this. I think I'm probably gonna wait like 2 days just to think about this because I'm so scared. Anyway, okay. Yeah. Okay, so the next step I've decided to do is, so it's gonna be a little hard to explain, but the cording channels that come out the bottom, I feel like they're kind of unstable. Like, I don't want to accidentally pull on one of these when I'm sewing and for the whole thing to come out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to go like somewhere where the casing will be like, I'm making the casing about 1/4 of an inch all the way around. So with like towards the end of that 1/4 inch, I'm just gonna sew like a few times back and forth to just make sure that these are super stabilized and like they won't, I don't know, I just like, I'm scared I'm just gonna pull these out and then I won't be able to do anything about it. So I think I'm gonna do that with all like these ones, and then on the other side too, and then along the top of the gussets right here, just to stabilize them. And then after that I can cut these down, and then I'll handle the next step of cutting down the straps and sewing them. And I just want to think about that a little bit more, even though I know what I'm gonna do. I don't know, I don't like to make quick decisions with this because this is literally taking me like months. So that's what I'm gonna do next, and I will show what I decide to do after that. This is all made up by me, by the way. I'm just thinking this out as I go. So anyway, that's where I am. Before I went around and sewed the edges, I decided to add a couple cording channels in each gusset because I saw a reference on Pinterest and I just really liked the way it looked. Then I went around the whole edge of the whole thing and sewed just a seam to hold it together. After that, I added an extra piece of fabric to the back, and I added a cording channel and a boning channel, and basically made a place for where the eyelets were gonna go. Then I folded under those little pieces and just sewed them up with a sewing machine. And next it was time to even up the bottom edge so that I could start getting the binding sewn on. But before I got the binding sewn on, I had to take out the basting stitches. I just felt like it would be hard to take out the basting stitches after the binding was done, and also there was really no reason for them now that the whole thing was sewn together. After I had finished with that, I made the binding, which was basically a strip of fabric that was 1 1/4 inches thick, and then I folded each edge down to the center to make a little piece of casing that I could wrap around the raw edges. And to attach the binding, I just felled it down on both sides, and when I was doing the felling, I tried to make the stitches strong, but as invisible as I could. One of the reasons I decided to fell in the first place was that I didn't want a lot of visible top stitching, just because I think it looks prettier, and also for a little bit of historical accuracy. After that, I was kind of done and wanted to take a break from binding, so I decided to do the eyelets. These are hand-sewn eyelets because they didn't have metal eyelets in the Regency era. So to do these, I just poked a hole with a big embroidery needle and then widened it with a sharpened pencil. and then I just whip stitched around the edge of each hole, I guess. And I like my stitches to be really even, so I make little dots with a erasable pen, and I found that this made them look really nice and even all the way down. I really love how this ended up looking, and I think it adds such a nice handmade look to the stays, and it just looks really beautiful. So after that, I had to return to the binding. To do this, I cut down the seam allowance on the edges, and then I wrapped the edges in the binding like I did before, pinned them, and sewed for an eternity, like centuries. It felt like I was sewing this binding on. When I was doing this particular bit of binding, I think I watched My Fair Lady, and that was definitely a good movie and a recommend. After I had all the binding sewn except for the front edge, it was time to secure down the excess fabric coming up from the busk pocket. So to do this, I cut down the fabric a little bit and then folded it down multiple times to align it with the 1/4 inch from the top mark. Then I just pinned it and felled it into place. Now while you're watching me fell this down, it's probably a good time to talk about how I did the binding on the front neck edge. There wasn't one cohesive strip of binding going all the way from the front shoulder to the other front shoulder. I had to split it into two to allow an opening for the busk to be inserted and taken out when the stays needed to be washed. So to do this, I realized that one short edge of each half needed to be finished so that I could align this with the bust pocket and there wouldn't be a bunch of raw edge sticking out. So as you'll see in a moment, I took one of the short edges of each of the binding strips going on the front and folded it down to about 1/8 of an inch and then just quickly and very loosely felled it into place to hold it. I'm literally terrified. Then it was time to cut down and even up the front edge. This was pretty terrifying because it's very hard to get accurate measurements when you have the gussets inserted, but I finally got it done. And after I attached the binding to the front, it was time to get the shoulder straps finally attached to each other so I can wear this. So what I decided to do was cut down the excess binding on the end of each strap and then turn it inside and overcast stitch the whole top edge. Then I used an extra little bit of binding and attached one of these little strips to each strap but on opposite sides. So when I'm done attaching these to each strap, I can overlap them and fell them down on the other strap so that it will be nice and secure and have a very clean finish. So as you can see here, with both bits of binding attached to the top edge, I just overlap them like this. And after getting these lined up approximately evenly, I finish filling them on either side. Hi everyone, I'm talking to you in a mirror because I'm too lazy to plug in an actual microphone. I have like 2 inches of stitching left to do on my stays, and this project has been going on for about 6 months, and I really don't want to finish it. Don't get me wrong, this has been a lovely project. I've loved working on it. It was the second project I ever really undertook. The first project I ever started filming, but I really don't want to finish it. So I think I'm just gonna power through and hopefully get this done, because I don't want to go to bed another day where this is not complete. So hopefully this will be the last day. April 18th marks the, I think, exact 6th month mark of when I started this project. So we're gonna try to get this thing done, because I don't want to make it any more than 6 months, because that is way too long. Anyway, let's go get to work. So I was really done by this point, but this day was exactly 6 months from when I had started this project, and I just did not want it to be 6 months and one day that this project was not done. I was just so ready to have this off my plate and be able to work on other things with my full focus and not have this nagging at me. So after I had finished attaching the straps together, the last little bit to do was to whip stitch the edges of the binding pieces closed so that everything looked nice and clean and there was no raw edges sticking out anywhere. After trying these on, I realized that the gussets were a little bit big for me, even when it was all finished. So I just added a drawstring through each gusset, and that fixed the problem for the most part. And here's me super excited that they're finally done and doing a weird dance because I don't want a boob to pop out on camera. I also added this little weird attachment with eyelets to make it easier to tie the drawstrings, but I might take it off because they kind of look ugly, I'm not sure. The very, very last thing I had to do was to cut down all of the scraggly bits of yarn everywhere and tuck them in. So to do this, I used nail clippers and some really sharp scissors, and then I used a very sharp embroidery needle to kind of just tuck the edges of the yarn that I couldn't cut down underneath into the cording channels so that everything had a nice clean finish. And with that, I was finally done. Alright guys, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something and took something good away from this. But I will see you in the next video.